You missed a spot." Karen Whitmore's voice sliced through the marble lobby like glass. Every head turned as she jabbed her manicured finger at the wet trail David Hale's mop left behind. "Honestly, does this building pay you to clean or to loiter? Even my shoes have more polish than your work." Her laughter, brittle and rehearsed, carried across the atrium. David didn't flinch. He wrung the mop slowly, water dripping in measured rhythm, then lifted his eyes with a calm that unsettled her smile. "Shoes can shine, Ms. Whitmore," he said quietly, "but not all stains can be scrubbed out with money." The air shifted. A few bystanders looked at him twice. "And that's when I'll tell you, stay right here. Because what happens in the next few minutes flips this entire humiliation upside down." Karen thought she was cutting down a janitor. What she didn't know was that the man she mocked once held lives in his hands. If you don't want to miss the moment this entire lobby witnesses the truth, hit subscribe now. David adjusted his grip on the mop handle, his posture steady. He didn't argue or defend himself further. That was never his way. Years of training, of silence and composure under pressure, had taught him the power of letting arrogance spend itself. He stood there in his faded uniform, a quiet contrast to the marble floors and sharp suits around him, and simply went back to work. To Lily, his 9-year-old daughter waiting by the side wall with her backpack, he wasn't a janitor. He was the man who remembered to cut the crusts off her sandwiches, who stayed awake through the night when her fevers climbed, who carried her on his shoulders past every luxury she thought belonged to other children. Watching Karen sneer at him tightened something in Lily's small chest, but her father's stillness told her what she needed. He wasn't ashamed. David had lived too much life to fear words. Once, long ago, his name had been spoken in operating theaters, carried on murmurs of respect down hospital corridors. But that was another world, one he'd left behind when love and loss demanded his presence at home. Now he swept floors others walked across without thought because keeping Lily safe and present mattered more than titles. The contrast could not have been sharper. Karen, head of Whitmore Holdings, heels clicking like punctuation marks of dominance. David, kneeling to wring water into a battered bucket, shoulders squared against a different kind of weight. But beneath the silence was a truth she could not imagine, a truth that would break open before the day ended. Where are you watching from? Remember this moment, because the woman who sneered at a mop and bucket has no idea she just humiliated the wrong man, a man carrying skills and scars she could never buy. And before long, this marble lobby will see who really commands the floor. The echo of David's words still lingered in the air, though Karen had already turned away with a huff, dismissing him as though he were beneath notice. Her entourage followed, their laughter clipped and shallow, but a few faces in the crowd stayed fixed on David. The janitor who hadn't bowed, hadn't apologized, hadn't even seemed rattled. He dipped his mop back into the bucket, as if the entire lobby confrontation was nothing more than background noise. Karen's voice floated back as the glass elevator doors closed behind her. "Keep this lobby spotless for once. Important people will be here tonight." Her reflection vanished into polished steel, leaving silence broken only by the squeak of rubber soles and the hum of the atrium fountain. David worked steadily, methodically. He didn't waste energy on her mockery. Lily was watching, and his example mattered more than his pride. He guided the mop across the floor with patient strokes, like he had guided so many moments of chaos in his former life, except no one here knew that. To them, he was the quiet man with a bucket. To Lily, he was the anchor that kept their world upright. From a bench near the fountain, Lily pulled out her sketchbook and crayons. She liked to draw her father in his uniform, not because she thought it was glamorous, but because she saw something no one else did. The calm strength in his posture, the way his eyes softened when they met hers. Her drawings never showed him as small, they showed him as steady. Two executives passed by, one muttering, "Strange," the way he answered her, not the usual type. The other shrugged, "Still a janitor." Their words faded as they disappeared into the elevator. David heard them, but his face remained composed. This was the life he chose. Dignity carried in silence, not shouted for in boardrooms. Yet fate never left dignity buried for long. Tonight, the building would host investors, clients, and partners. It was a gathering designed to display wealth, power, and polish, all things Karen valued more than people. For David, it was just another shift, though he knew Lily's eyes would widen at the glittering dresses and crystal glasses she glimpsed from the edges. She loved stories, and such nights always painted pictures in her mind. Karen's return hours later was as grand as her departure. She swept through the lobby with a cluster of aides, her diamond necklace flashing under the chandelier. She didn't look at David, though her heels clicked louder, as if to remind him of her importance. A deliberate silence, sharper than words. But Lily noticed something else. Her father's hand tightening briefly on the mop handle, the way his eyes scanned the crowd, like he was memorizing every detail. It was the same look he gave her when they crossed busy streets, when he checked her fever in the night, when storms rattled their windows. She didn't know why it mattered, only that it made her feel safe. The building buzzed with conversation. Laughter echoed, champagne fizzed, and the orchestra in the corner tuned its strings. Karen played hostess flawlessly, her smile practiced, her gestures rehearsed. David moved quietly among servers and staff, collecting glasses, wiping spills, blending into the background as if invisible. Yet with every pass, his eyes noted exits, obstacles, and the rhythm of the room. Old habits never died. Near the fountain, Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, do you think she'll be nice to you one day?" Her voice was soft, carrying the innocent hope only children believed in. David crouched, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "What matters is, we're nice to others, even when they're not. That's our strength." He smiled, though his chest tightened. She didn't need to know how fragile her question made him feel. Across the lobby, Karen's laughter rang louder than the music, her arm linked with the visiting investors. She gestured toward the chandelier, boasting about its imported crystals. To her, the evening was a theater of power. To David, it was just another stage waiting for an unscripted moment, and it came sooner than anyone expected. One of the senior executives, Mr. Alvarez, a man who had shaken hands with half the room, stumbled near the buffet. At first, guests thought it was clumsiness, but when his glass shattered and his body convulsed, the music screeched to a halt. Gasps erupted as he collapsed on the polished floor. Karen froze. The crowd pressed back, their murmurs rising in fear. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Another fumbled with a phone. But seconds stretched and panic thickened. David's mop clattered against the bucket as he moved faster than anyone had seen him move all night. Lily's sketchbook fell to the ground, forgotten as her eyes widened. The man everyone ignored was suddenly at the center. Victory strategy progress. The crisis has begun to unfold, setting the stage for David's hidden expertise to surface. Karen's humiliation of him sharpens the irony of what's coming. Emotional focus, build tension and anticipation, shifting from simmering injustice to sudden crisis. Discovery method, behavioral foreshadowing. David's steady scanning, calm posture, and instinctive awareness hint at more than his janitor role. The crowd's shock rippled like a wave through the marble lobby. Champagne flutes toppled, a woman shrieked, and the orchestra cut off mid-note. Mr. Alvarez lay motionless, his face drained of color, the crystal shards glittering like ice around his convulsing body. For a heartbeat, no one moved, paralyzed between disbelief and fear. Karen's voice broke the silence. "Someone! Call security! Get medical help now!" Her command cracked, betraying the panic beneath her practiced poise. Guests fumbled for their phones, but their hands shook more than their voices steadied. The opulence of the evening meant nothing in that moment. Power and money could not force life back into the executive's body. David was already moving. His janitor's uniform blurred as he dropped to his knees beside Alvarez. Calm, precise hands checked the airway, the pulse. Lily gasped but didn't cry out. She knew that look in her father's eyes. It was the same look he wore when storms howled outside their apartment, and she asked if everything would be okay. The crowd parted reluctantly, unsure why the man with the mop had taken charge. A server whispered, "What's he doing?" Another muttered, "Shouldn't we wait for paramedics?" Yet no one stepped closer. Their fear chained them, but David's training propelled him forward. "Clear space," David said firmly, his voice carrying over the panic. "Now." The authority in his tone startled them. It wasn't the voice of a janitor. It was the voice of command, of someone who had given life and death orders before, and people obeyed. Chairs scraped back. Guests stumbled aside, eyes wide with confusion. Karen hovered near the fountain, frozen between pride and fear. "You can't. He's an executive," she stammered. But her words died as David tilted Alvarez's head back, beginning chest compressions with practiced rhythm. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The world narrowed to the sound of his palms pressing against ribs, the desperate fight for circulation. Gasps filled the silence each time David's breath sealed Alvarez's mouth. Seconds felt like hours. Sweat beaded at his temple, but his movements were steady, precise. Lily edged forward, clutching her sketchbook to her chest now. Her small voice trembled but carried across the lobby. "Daddy knows what to do." Heads turned toward her, and the truth in her words unsettled the room. For the first time they wondered, who exactly was this man? Karen's diamond necklace glimmered as she stepped closer, torn between outrage and desperation. "This is insane. We need real doctors." Her protest broke, thin with fear, and yet, as she spoke, Alvarez's body gave a shuddering cough beneath David's hands, a sound of life. The collective gasp of the room was louder than the orchestra had been minutes earlier. Some clutched their mouths, others leaned in, all eyes locked on the janitor who had defied their expectations. David continued compressions until Alvarez's breathing steadied, shallow but present. Only then did he ease back, checking pulse again, his jaw clenched against memory and grief. The security team rushed in belatedly, radios crackling, eyes darting to Karen for instruction. She pointed toward David, her voice faltering. He just... The words wouldn't come. Authority, for once, had abandoned her. David rose slowly, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. He didn't bask in the stares or the silence. He only looked at Lily, whose eyes shone with fierce pride. He had promised himself long ago never to step back into this role, never to reopen wounds that healing had only sealed with scars. But tonight, he had no choice. The ambulance sirens wailed faintly in the distance now. Relief murmured through the crowd, but no one moved to fill the silence around David. Every suit and silk dress seemed smaller beside him. The man they had dismissed minutes earlier had just pulled life back into the building's most senior executive. Karen swallowed hard, forcing composure into her trembling voice. Well, I suppose anyone can learn CPR. It was weak, defensive, but it was all she had. She straightened her shoulders as though a diamond necklace could anchor her dignity, but Lily's whisper, spoken as if it were only meant for Karen, cut sharper than glass. He's not just anyone. My dad used to be a doctor. The words echoed, carried by the silence of the lobby, landing in every ear like a verdict. Victory, strategy, progress. David's hidden expertise is revealed through direct crisis intervention, undermining Karen's earlier humiliation. The crowd has witnessed his authority and skill firsthand, creating the stage for full vindication. Emotional focus, awe, and tension. Viewers should feel the shift from helpless panic to stunned respect, anchored by Lily's innocent truth. Discovery method. Crisis. Trigger. David's decisive actions in the emergency expose his real identity. The hush that followed Lily's whisper pressed heavier than the chandelier above them. Every face in the lobby shifted, not toward the gasping executive on the floor, but toward the little girl whose words had cracked open a hidden truth. My dad used to be a doctor. It was not shouted. It didn't need to be. Innocence had carried it further than authority ever could. Karen blinked, caught off guard. The diamond smile she wielded at investors faltered, her polished control thinning like paper left in rain. She glanced at David, searching his face for denial, for embarrassment, for some excuse that might dissolve the child's claim. But David didn't offer her anything. He just knelt one more time beside Alvarez, checking the man's pulse with a calm steadiness that silenced doubts more than words ever could. The paramedics burst in through the revolving doors, red lights flashing against the glass walls. They hustled to Alvarez's side, voices clipped, movements quick. Yet when they saw David already had the executive stabilized, their posture shifted from urgency to respect. One paramedic, a grizzled veteran with lined eyes, nodded subtly. Who started compressions? David didn't answer. Lily's voice carried again before he could speak. My dad. The team worked quickly, attaching oxygen, lifting Alvarez onto a stretcher. Relief flooded the crowd, but the undercurrent of disbelief remained. The janitor, the man mocked not 30 minutes ago, had done what no executive, no CEO, no polished guest could. Karen adjusted her necklace, reclaiming her stage presence. Well, she said loudly, as though volume might overwrite the memory of panic. Thank you, everyone, for remaining calm. Of course, our staff is trained for emergencies. She cast a pointed look at David, twisting his act into something corporate, rehearsed. But her words rang hollow, bouncing against the silence of those who had seen the truth with their own eyes. A young server whispered near the fountain, too loudly to be missed. That wasn't training, that was a doctor's hands. Heads nodded subtly. The first seeds of recognition took root in the marble soil of the lobby. David stood slowly, brushing his palms against his uniform. He did not correct Karen, nor did he bow to the murmurs now shifting in his favor. He simply gathered the mop he had abandoned, its handle still wet, and leaned it against the bucket. To him, saving a life wasn't theater. It was muscle memory, carved into him through years of long nights and desperate calls. Karen's pride bristled. She stepped closer, her heels clicking too sharply. What's your name again? Hale, isn't it? She said it like a challenge, like she might bend his history into submission by pronouncing it with disdain. David Hale, he replied evenly. His voice carried without effort. And yes, I used to be a doctor. Gasps echoed like applause withheld, the room caught between scandal and awe. Karen forced a laugh, brittle and desperate. Well, I suppose scrubbing floors and scrubbing in for surgery aren't so different. Her entourage chuckled weakly, but the sound collapsed under the weight of stares from guests who weren't laughing anymore. Lily stepped to her father's side, slipping her hand into his. Her small fingers squeezed his calloused ones, grounding him in the moment. For her, the reveal wasn't humiliation, it was vindication. She had watched too many days when her father's silence swallowed insults. Tonight, she saw the silence break. The lobby, once filled with strings and crystal, had become a theater of truth. Guests whispered in pockets, eyes darting between Karen's forced smile and David's calm composure. The authority that money once bought seemed thin compared to the authority of saving a man's life. When the stretcher rolled out and the ambulance doors slammed shut, the echoes left behind belonged not to Karen, but to David. His uniform, damp from the mop water, clung to him like a disguise everyone had finally seen through. Karen leaned closer, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "Don't think this changes anything. You work here. Remember that." David met her eyes. There was no defiance, no aggression, only quiet truth. "I remember everything." His words, simple as they were, unsettled her more than any shouted threat. Lily tugged his sleeve gently. "Daddy, can we go home now?" He nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. But before they could leave, the ripple of voices caught them again. A guest in a tailored suit said clearly, "If that man hadn't been here, Alvarez would be gone." Another replied, "And she called him useless." The crowd's memory had already chosen its story, and Karen was losing control of it. Victory strategy progress. The reveal has deepened. David's expertise is no longer whispered, but spoken aloud. Karen's attempt to reclaim dominance falters in front of witnesses. Emotional focus, rising vindication, and quiet pride. Tension between Karen's arrogance and the crowd's shifting perception. Discovery method. Reputation leak. Lily's innocent confession spreads, reinforced by bystanders who recognize David's true skill. The murmurs didn't die with the closing ambulance doors. They grew, curling through the marble lobby like smoke. Conversations hushed when Karen moved too close, but the whispers carried behind her back. Guests who once hung on her every word now leaned toward one another, retelling the same scene. The janitor saving Alvarez, the daughter's whisper that cracked the ceiling of his disguise. Karen felt it. Power had always been her stage, but tonight her spotlight flickered. She straightened her shoulders, scanning the crowd with a polished smile, but every glance that slid past her to David felt like a betrayal. She hated the weight of his silence, more than his words. It forced others to fill the void with their own stories. David stood by the fountain, Lily's hand clasped in his. He wasn't posturing, wasn't chasing acknowledgement. If anything, he wanted to leave quietly. But the current of attention pulled toward him, no matter how hard he tried to fade back into the rhythm of a janitor's night. A junior associate broke the tension first. "Mr. Hale," he said hesitantly, "what you did was remarkable. If you hadn't acted—" His words trailed off, the implication hanging heavy. David nodded once, grateful but reserved. Karen cut in swiftly. Yes, he was adequate. Her tone wrapped the word in condescension. But let's not forget, it was our emergency system and staff that handled the situation. Protocol works, after all. She gestured toward the paramedics' exit as though they belonged to her payroll. The crowd didn't fully buy it, and she knew it. So she doubled down, raising her voice for the investors still lingering. Now, let's return to why we're here, building partnerships, securing futures, and showing what Whitmore Holdings truly stands for. Her speech scattered like glass on tile, No one clapped. The orchestra hesitated before striking a soft note again, but the mood had shifted. The gleam of wealth no longer masked the cracks in the evening. Lily leaned against her father's side, whispering up at him. "Why is she still mad at you? You helped." Her eyes were wide, questioning the logic of a world that punished kindness. David brushed her hair back gently. "Some people are afraid of losing control, Lily. When they do, they get angry." His voice was calm, but inside, old memories stirred. Boardrooms where pride outweighed truth, where power silenced compassion. This wasn't new. It was just another version of the same stage he had once walked away from. Karen turned her sharp gaze on him again, unwilling to let the moment drift. "Mr. Hale?" she called across the lobby, the words wrapped in mock civility. "Since you're so eager to step out of your role tonight, perhaps you'd like to explain why a former doctor is mopping floors instead of practicing medicine." The question pierced through the crowd like a blade. Heads turned. Anticipation thickened. Karen had shifted the focus, hoping scandal would smother admiration. David felt Lily's grip tighten. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself before he answered. "Because some lives can't be saved," he said simply. His voice didn't waver, but grief threaded through the calm. "And because the life that could still be saved was sitting right here beside me." He looked down at Lily. His words weren't an excuse. They were the truth. The crowd absorbed it differently than Karen expected. Instead of laughter or scorn, silence deepened into respect. Guests saw not shame, but sacrifice. A man who had once carried titles had laid them down for a greater one, father. Karen faltered again, her plan slipping. She tried to laugh, sharp and dismissive. "Touching? But this is a place of business, not bedtime stories." But her interruption couldn't erase the image. David kneeling beside a dying man, saving him without hesitation, then turning back to his daughter, as if she was the center of the world. The juxtaposition rang louder than her arrogance. Near the elevator, one of the senior investors, a man with a stern jaw and measured voice, stepped forward. "I'd rather have a partner who understands responsibility and sacrifice than one who only understands luxury." His words weren't aimed at David. They were aimed at her. The crowd murmured in agreement, subtle but undeniable. Karen's face stiffened. For the first time in years, she wasn't the center of admiration. She was the backdrop to someone else's truth. David felt Lily press against him, her small body warm against his side. He hadn't wanted this. He never sought a stage, never craved applause. But the truth had found him anyway, dragged into the open by crisis and a child's voice. Karen masked her faltering control with icy charm. "Well then," she said briskly, "I suppose we'll all remember tonight for unexpected entertainment?" She pivoted, her heels snapping against the marble, rallying what remained of her pride. But every step echoed not triumph, but retreat. Victory strategy progress. David's dignity is reinforced through Karen's failed attempt to weaponize his past. His truth reshapes the crowd's perception, drawing investors' respect away from Karen. Emotional focus, respect rising for David, frustration building for Karen, pride and grounding for Lily. Discovery method, symbolic object. David's humble mop and uniform, once symbols of dismissal, now stand in contrast to the dignity of his sacrifice and past. Karen's heels echoed toward the elevator, each sharp click a defiance against the shifting tide in the lobby. She thought distance might reclaim her composure, but whispers trailed her steps, louder now, emboldened. Investors, staff, even servers repeated fragments of David's quiet confession. A doctor who had chosen fatherhood, a janitor who had saved a man's life while power stood frozen. David didn't move to follow her. He stood where he was, Lily's hand still in his, mop bucket by his side, like a man rooted in both worlds, the one he had left behind and the one he carried now. He had no interest in prolonging conflict, but conflict had a way of finding him. Karen spun back before the elevator doors could close. Her voice rose across the atrium, carrying a brittle sharpness that betrayed desperation. "Let's not forget," she declared, her eyes sweeping the crowd, "that whatever his past may be, Mr. Hale cleans our floors now. He works here because he couldn't keep the life he once had." The words landed like stones, designed to bruise. A few gasps fluttered, but most eyes turned to David again. He didn't flinch. His silence absorbed the cruelty, just as it had absorbed humiliation hours earlier. But this time he didn't remain completely still. He stepped forward. "Ms. Whitmore," he said evenly, "you're right. I clean your floors. I keep them safe, keep them clear, so no one slips, so no one gets hurt. That's the job." He paused, his gaze sweeping the same crowd she had tried to command. "And when a life was slipping away tonight, I did that job too. I kept someone from falling further." The air thickened with the weight of his words. No theatrics, no defense, just truth, spoken in the steady cadence of a man who knew what mattered. Karen's jaw tightened. "So what? Do you expect applause? A parade because you remembered a few tricks from your past?" She laughed, brittle and strained. "You're still a man who gave it all up." David didn't bristle. His eyes softened as he looked at Lily, who clutched his sleeve. "I didn't give it up," he said. "I gave it to her." He nodded toward his daughter, and the crowd's attention followed. In that moment, his worn uniform was no longer a mark of shame, but a badge of sacrifice. Lily blushed under the sudden gazes, but she didn't look away. She lifted her chin, the simple courage of a child mirroring her father's quiet strength. A silence stretched, then cracked with a voice from the back. "I know Alvarez," said one of the investors, his tone clipped but resolute. "He wouldn't be alive if not for this man. That's not failure. That's the kind of leadership this company should respect." Applause didn't break out, not yet, but nods passed. Through the crowd, subtle affirmations that Karen could not silence. The weight of judgment was no longer in her favor. Karen tried again, desperation sharpening her tongue. "You think saving one man changes everything? This is a corporation. We build empires, not bedtime stories. He doesn't belong here." David shook his head slowly. "Belonging isn't decided by suits or titles. It's proven by actions. Tonight, I didn't prove anything new. I just did what I've always done. Protect people. Whether in an operating room or with a mop in my hands, that's who I am." The line carried through the lobby with the strength of something undeniable. Guests shifted murmuring agreement, some openly, others with guarded glances at Karen. Her grip on the room was slipping, and she knew it. Lily tugged his arm gently, whispering, "Daddy, can we go now?" Her voice was small, but it carried further than she realized. People smiled, softening, because in her request they saw the truth of his sacrifice, not for glory, not for recognition, but for her. David crouched, meeting her eyes. "Soon, sweetheart, just a little longer." His voice was tender, but the crowd heard it too. It was the voice of a father who had chosen love over prestige, and they respected it more than any corporate speech. Karen's expression hardened into a mask, but behind her eyes flickered something raw, fear. Fear that the story was no longer hers to control. She opened her mouth to retort, but an older woman in pearls, an investor's wife, spoke first. "I'd rather trust a man who knows sacrifice than a woman who knows only scorn. The remark landed with finality. Karen flinched. The orchestra began again, tentative, as though trying to stitch the evening back together. But the mood had changed forever. David didn't revel in it. He simply stood, his daughter at his side, ready to walk out with his dignity intact. Victory, strategy, progress. David openly claims his choice of fatherhood as strength, not shame. The crowd begins siding against Karen, eroding her authority. Emotional focus, pride and vindication for David, admiration from the crowd, desperation and fear from Karen. Discovery method. Behavioral foreshadowing evolves into confirmation. His choices and sacrifices are voiced directly, tying his past and present into one coherent truth. The orchestra's strings hummed uncertainly, trying to smooth the jagged edges of the night, but the mood in the marble lobby refused to mend. People no longer lingered at Karen's side for her charm or her power. Their eyes kept drifting toward David, toward the man in the faded uniform who had saved a life while everyone else stood helpless. Karen felt it like a fracture beneath her feet. For years, she had controlled this building like a stage, every polished surface and glittering light reflecting her dominance. Tonight, though, she couldn't stop the audience from choosing a new story. Her voice had always commanded attention, but now silence followed her words like shadows, while whispers trailed David's truth. David shifted the mop bucket, ready to leave. He never wanted to stand at the center of judgment, and he certainly didn't want Lily standing there with him. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, but before they could move toward the service corridor, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Hale?" It was the senior investor from earlier, the man whose measured tone carried weight across the room. He stepped forward, his gaze steady, ignoring Karen's glare. "I owe you thanks. Alvarez is a friend, as well as a colleague. You saved him tonight." David inclined his head, modest as ever. "I only did what anyone should do." "Not anyone," the investor replied firmly. His words resonated, echoing where Karen's had failed. "Only someone trained, someone capable, someone who knew exactly what to do when seconds mattered. That makes a difference." The guests murmured agreement. Karen's smile froze in place, but her eyes flashed. "Yes, yes," she interjected. "But let's not rewrite the evening. One moment doesn't outweigh an entire career of decisions. Mr. Hale is a janitor, and that's the role he plays here." Her words dripped with venom, but the crowd wasn't convinced. For the first time, her attempt to dismiss him sounded desperate, rather than decisive. Lily's small voice rose again, unplanned but piercing. "He's more than that." She hugged her sketchbook to her chest, the pages filled with drawings of her father. Not as a janitor, but as the strong, steady figure who never let her down. "He's my dad. That's the most important job." The lobby softened, shoulders easing, eyes warming. The child's declaration cut deeper than arguments or titles. Parents in the crowd felt it. Even those who weren't parents recognized the sincerity no diamond necklace could imitate. David crouched beside her, his expression tender. "That's enough, Lily," he whispered. But the words were already planted. He couldn't take them back, and maybe he didn't want to. Karen's laugh rang false. "Touching," she sneered. "But this isn't a fairy tale. Investors don't make decisions based on bedtime drawings." She looked to the guests, trying to summon old alliances. "We make them based on leadership, control, and strength." The investor who had spoken earlier didn't back down. "And strength looks different tonight, Ms. Whitmore. Control didn't save Alvarez. Leadership didn't come from your podium." He gestured toward David. It came from a man willing to kneel on the floor without hesitation, willing to act when no one else did. Applause started. hesitant at first, then stronger. It wasn't the wild clapping of celebration. It was the measured approval of recognition, the kind that couldn't be spun away by spin or arrogance. Karen's face burned beneath the chandeliers. Light. She snapped her fingers at the orchestra. Music. Louder. The strings swelled obediently, but the applause still rang louder in memory than any note. David rose, weary of the theater. He didn't want applause, didn't want the role of hero. He wanted to take Lily home, to tuck her into bed, to let the world forget his name. But he could feel the tide turning, and he knew Karen would not let him leave without one last attempt to shatter his dignity. She stepped forward, heels clicking against marble. "You think you've won their sympathy tonight, Mr. Hale? Sympathy fades. Tomorrow you'll still be the man with a mop, forgotten the moment these people return to their lives." Her words carried a venomous certainty, but David answered with calm truth. "Maybe, but Alvarez will wake up tomorrow because I was here, and my daughter will wake up tomorrow knowing her father stood tall, no matter what others said." That truth, spoken without anger, was heavier than all her arrogance. The crowd felt it. They shifted again, their respect solidifying into something Karen couldn't undo. Lily squeezed his hand tighter, her eyes shining. "Can we go home now?" she asked again, her innocence reminding everyone that beneath the corporate polish, life was fragile, simple, and sacred. David nodded. "Soon," he murmured. But his gaze didn't leave Karen. He wasn't threatening her, wasn't challenging her, but his very presence, the steadiness she couldn't break, had become a mirror she couldn't bear to face. Victory, strategy, progress. The crowd's respect crystallizes around David, turning Lily's words into a moral anchor the room cannot ignore. Karen's authority cracks further as her dismissal fails in the face of truth and public recognition. Emotional focus, warmth, admiration, and rising vindication for David, contrasted with Karen's spiraling desperation. Discovery method. Reputation leak reinforced. Lily's innocent affirmation strengthens what the crowd already suspects, making David's sacrifice undeniable. Karen's mask of control cracked, though she tried to hide it beneath another brittle smile. The applause still echoed faintly in the lobby, leaving her no room to reassert dominance. She straightened her back, willing her voice into steel. "Enough of this sideshow," she declared, though her words trembled. "This is my building, my company, my event, and I will not have it hijacked by sentiment." But sentiment had already rooted itself in the crowd. Investors and staff alike had witnessed too much to return to blind loyalty. Their gazes no longer followed Karen's sweeping gestures. They lingered on David, the man who had acted when none of them could. David didn't bask in it. He lowered his eyes, shifting the mop bucket slightly, as if he could step back into invisibility, but the moment refused to release him. Lily tugged his sleeve again, sensing his unease. "Daddy, can we really go now?" He squeezed her hand gently. "Almost," he whispered, though he knew Karen wouldn't let them leave without one final strike. And sure enough, her heels clicked sharply as she strode toward him, cutting through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "You think this makes you special?" she hissed, though her voice carried for all to hear. "You had a chance once, doctor, was it? And now look at you. You're nothing but a man in overalls with a mop. Don't think saving one executive changes the truth?" The crowd stiffened, waiting for his response. David met her eyes steadily, his face calm. "The truth," he said softly, "is that life isn't measured by what title you keep. It's measured by what you give. And tonight, I gave what I could." His words cut deeper than any retort could have, A hush settled. Even the orchestra stilled again as if afraid to drown out the moment. Karen tried to laugh, but it rang false. Poetic. But this company doesn't run on poetry. It runs on results. She gestured toward the guests. Do you really think any of you would trust the future of your investments to a man who abandoned his career? It was then that the senior investor, the one whose voice had carried authority earlier, spoke again. He didn't abandon it. He redirected it. Sacrificing prestige for family isn't weakness. It's the strongest choice a man can make. Agreement rippled across the room. Some nodded openly, others whispered, but the tide was undeniable. For the first time in her career, Karen's grip on perception was slipping beyond recovery. Lily looked up at her father, pride glowing in her young eyes. See, Daddy? They know now. David bent slightly, pressing a hand gently to her shoulder. What matters is that you know, Lily. That's always been enough for me. His voice carried warmth, but the crowd heard every word. In his humility, they saw strength that no corner office could buy. Karen, desperate, clapped her hands sharply. Fine. If we're rewriting this evening into a charity gala, then let's finish it properly. She turned on David with venom disguised as civility. Prove it. If you're truly what your daughter claims, then step into the light. Explain yourself to everyone here. Let them hear your story, if you dare. She thought the challenge would corner him, force him into either silence or self-pity. Instead, David stood taller, his hand still resting lightly on Lily's shoulder. He didn't seek the spotlight, but he no longer avoided it either. My story isn't complicated, he began, his voice steady but low enough that the room had to lean in. I was a surgeon once. I saved lives in hospitals, wore the white coat, heard the praise. But when my wife died, I had a choice. I could keep chasing prestige, or I could be present for my daughter. I chose her. The room absorbed it in silence, heavy with the weight of sacrifice. David continued, each word precise. It cost me the career I built. It cost me the respect of people who only measure worth in titles. But it gave me something greater. Her smile, her safety, her future. That's why I'm here. Not because I failed, but because I refused to fail her. Tears pricked Lily's eyes, though she smiled brightly. The crowd shifted, moved by the clarity of his truth. No spin, no performance. Just raw, unshakable love. Karen faltered, her mouth opened, but no words came. For once, her weaponized tongue had nothing sharp enough to cut through what he had said. From the back, another voice rose. That's leadership, someone murmured, and others echoed it. The phrase caught like fire. Leadership. Not power, not control. Leadership born of sacrifice and presence. Karen's face paled. She snapped at the orchestra again, desperate for sound to cover the murmurs. But the music no longer belonged to her. The narrative had shifted, and no crescendo could bury it. David reached for Lily's hand once more. Now we can go, he whispered, and this time he meant it. But even as he turned toward the service corridor, he knew the night wasn't finished. Karen wouldn't surrender her pride quietly. Her silence now was only the calm before her storm. Victory, strategy, progress. David voices his sacrifice openly, framing it as strength, not weakness. The crowd begins to view him not only as a rescuer, but as a leader with moral authority. Emotional focus, respect, admiration, and inspiration for David. Desperation and unraveling for Karen. Discovery method. Symbolic object and reputation now merge. His mop uniform, once ridicule, now frames his sacrifice in sharp relief against Karen's crumbling authority. David guided Lily toward the service corridor, his shoulders lowered with the quiet relief of leaving. He had said more than he ever intended, revealed pieces of himself he had locked away for years. Tonight, though, truth had been unavoidable. He had saved a life, and in doing so, exposed his own. All he wanted now was to shield Lily from the storm of stares still trailing them. But Karen was not finished. Humiliation burned hotter than the chandelier's lights above her, and she would not let the night end with her diminished. With a snap of her fingers, she halted the orchestra again, her heels striking like gunfire as she marched across the marble lobby. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Hale?" Her voice dripped venom. "You stand here, spin a sob story, win sympathy from a gullible crowd, and now you walk away? Convenient." David stopped, not for himself, but for Lily, whose hand tightened around his. He turned slowly, his gaze calm, though the crowd's eyes pressed against him like a tide. "I've given enough of myself to this room tonight," he said evenly. "There's nothing more to prove." But Karen smiled with the sharpness of someone ready to wound. "Oh, but there is. You've painted yourself as some noble father, some tragic hero who traded his career for a child. Yet I wonder—" She raised her voice deliberately, making sure every ear caught the words. "What happens tomorrow when the truth spreads? Do you think hospitals will welcome back a man who abandoned his oath? Do you think anyone will see a doctor in you again, or only a janitor with excuses?" The words cut, sharper because they struck near old scars. David felt Lily's eyes on him, worried and searching, as if she could sense the pain behind his stillness. He inhaled slowly, drawing strength from the small hand clasped in his own. "I don't need them to see a doctor," he replied. "I only need her to see a father, and she always will." The lobby trembled with the weight of the exchange. Some guests nodded, their respect deepening. Others glanced at Karen with unease, recognizing the cruelty beneath her polish. For the first time, she was no longer simply arrogant, she was desperate, lashing out against a man who had already won something greater than titles. An investor cleared his throat, stepping closer. "Ms. Whitmore," he said carefully, "there's no shame in sacrifice. Many of us would do the same if faced with such a choice." His words were diplomatic, but the undertone was unmistakable. The room was slipping further from her grasp. Karen's smile faltered, but she recovered with forced brightness. How quaint. But sacrifice doesn't run a corporation. Results do. She gestured broadly at the opulence around them, the chandeliers, the marble, the wealth. This is built on strength, not sentiment, and I refuse to let one man's personal tragedy overshadow what this company represents." David's voice cut gently through the noise. "Then perhaps that's the problem. You measure strength by what you build for yourself. I measure it by what I protect for others." He didn't raise his tone, but the crowd leaned in as if gravity pulled them closer. His words carried further than her diamonds ever could. Lily, still clutching her sketchbook, lifted it timidly. "I drew him as a hero," she said, her small voice reaching ears that strained for every sound, "because he always saves me." She looked around the room with childlike earnestness. "And he saved your friend too. Doesn't that mean he's a hero?" Silence pressed down, heavy and undeniable. Even those hardened by years of boardrooms and contracts felt the truth of her words. The innocence of a child had broken through where arguments and pride could not. Karen's face tightened. For a moment it seemed she might shout, might unleash her full fury, but the crowd's eyes pinned her in place, and she knew it would destroy her further. She swallowed, her mask trembling. "Children are easily fooled," she muttered, too low for conviction, yet loud enough to wound. The crowd recoiled. Gasps and murmurs erupted. Karen's cruelty had crossed a line. The admiration she once commanded crumbled into disdain. No investor wanted to be seen siding with someone who sneered at a child's love. David's expression didn't shift, though his hand tightened around Lily's. He didn't need to respond. The crowd had answered for him. Their silence, their glares, their whispers, all of it turned Karen's venom back on her. The senior investor stepped forward once more, his voice firm. "Enough, Ms. Whitmore. Tonight revealed more than you intended. It showed us who saves lives and who clings to pride. I know where I place my respect." Applause began again, stronger this time, no longer hesitant. It rolled across the lobby, bouncing against the marble and glass, a tide Karen could not silence. David bowed his head slightly, not in arrogance, but in gratitude. He gathered Lily close, her sketchbook pressed between them like a shield. The applause wasn't for him, it was for what he stood for. And though he still longed for quiet, he knew the night was moving toward something bigger than his escape. Karen stood frozen, fury coiled beneath her brittle smile. She had lost the crowd, lost her authority, but she wasn't finished. David could see it in her eyes. The storm wasn't over. Victory, strategy, progress. Karen escalates her attack, but David and Lily's responses, rooted in truth and love, turn the crowd fully against her. His quiet dignity triumphs over her cruelty, shifting authority toward him. Emotional focus, rising vindication for David, pride for Lily, disgust and rejection toward Karen. Discovery method, crisis. Trigger reinforced. Karen's cruelty toward Lily crystallizes the crowd's recognition of David's true worth. Karen's brittle smile held, but only just. The applause that had swelled for David still pulsed faintly in the air, a reminder she could not silence. For years, she had dominated these rooms with nothing more than poise and authority. Yet tonight her words had lost their power. Each attempt to humiliate David had only exposed her desperation, and the crowd's patience had run thin. David stood steady, Lily tucked close at his side, the sketchbook pressed between them. He had said all he needed to say. In truth, he wanted nothing more than to walk out, to take his daughter home, to close the door on the glittering cruelty of this world. But Karen blocked the way, her heels digging into the marble like claws, her pride refusing to let the night slip from her grasp. "You've made quite the scene," she spat, her voice pitched low, but carrying in the hush that followed. "But I won't let this spectacle define my company. I built this empire. I will not have it undone by a janitor with a tragic story." The words drew sharp breaths from the crowd. Her arrogance had crossed into self-destruction, but she pressed forward, trying to wrestle control back by force. She gestured toward the investors. "You came here tonight to see Whitmore Holdings' strength. Do not mistake sympathy for leadership. You know what I offer: power, results, certainty." But certainty no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the man who had knelt on the floor and saved a life. It belonged to the father who had chosen sacrifice over prestige. The senior investor, unflinching, stepped closer to her. "What I know," he said firmly, "is that leadership showed itself tonight, and it did not come from you." The crowd murmured in agreement. Karen's throat tightened, her mask cracking. She turned back to David, her eyes blazing. "Tell them then," she demanded, almost shrieking. "Tell them why you really left your career. Tell them the truth. I'm sure you're hiding, because I don't believe for a second that you gave it all up willingly." Her challenge hung in the air, poisonous but gripping. Guests leaned in, hungry for clarity. David's past, hinted at but never fully revealed, had become the axis on which the room now turned. Lily pressed closer against him, sensing the weight of what Karen demanded. David exhaled slowly, the memory sharp as glass behind his eyes. He had avoided it for years, protecting Lily from the heaviness of it all. But tonight, surrounded by eyes that had witnessed both cruelty and compassion, he chose not to hide. "My wife," he began quietly, his voice roughened by memory, "was taken suddenly. I was at the hospital, working through another night that never ended. I wasn't there when she needed me most. I wasn't there when Lily lost her mother." Gasps whispered through the crowd, but David pressed on, steady despite the ache. "After that, I realized I couldn't keep saving strangers at the cost of losing the one person who depended on me. So I walked away. Not because I couldn't endure medicine, but because I couldn't endure missing the life that mattered most." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Karen, poised to strike, faltered. The truth was raw, undeniable, and it stripped her cruelty bare. No amount of polish could compete with sacrifice spoken plainly. Lily looked up at him with wide, tearful eyes. She had known pieces of the story, but hearing it aloud felt different. Heavier, yes, but also proud. She squeezed his hand with all her strength. "You were there for me?" she whispered, and her words carried further than she knew. The crowd shifted, many openly moved. A woman dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief. A man shook his head slowly, murmuring, "That's what real strength is." Karen tried to sneer, to twist it. "So you abandoned your calling for guilt? That's weakness, not strength." But the senior investor cut her off sharply. "No, that's humanity. And humanity is what I want in the people I trust." He turned to the others, his voice rising. "We've followed arrogance long enough. Tonight, we saw what true leadership looks like. It's time we acknowledge it." Applause erupted again, louder this time, resonant, undeniable. It filled the lobby, reverberating against marble and glass, drowning out Karen's protests. David closed his eyes briefly, the sound washing over him like a tide. He didn't smile, didn't bask. He only turned to Lily, brushing a hand gently against her hair. For her, all of this mattered more than recognition. It meant safety. It meant dignity. It meant she could walk through the world knowing her father stood tall. Karen stood isolated now, her entourage shrinking back, unwilling to share in her downfall. The empire she had flaunted so boldly looked brittle under the weight of the night's truth. Still she clung to pride, refusing to yield. David straightened, meeting her gaze one last time. "You wanted the truth," he said evenly. "There it is. Do with it what you will. But understand this. You cannot take away what I've chosen to give." Karen's lips parted, but no words came. The silence that followed was not hers. It belonged to him. Victory, strategy, progress. David's past is fully revealed, cementing the moral core of his sacrifice. The crowd aligns decisively with him, while Karen's authority collapses further. Emotional focus, deep empathy for David, admiration from the crowd, and the raw, painful pride of Lily. Discovery method, crisis trigger, culmination. His confession becomes the ultimate reveal, turning Karen's last attack into her final defeat. The silence in the lobby stretched thick and heavy. Karen's lips were parted, but no words came. Her power had always been in her ability to command a room, to bend perception with confidence and polish. Now, stripped of those weapons, she stood exposed. The crowd wasn't waiting for her anymore. Their eyes had shifted, fixed on David. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't begged for respect, hadn't paraded his past. He had simply told the truth, and in that truth, the crowd found what they had been missing. An investor near the front clapped, slow and deliberate. Another joined. Then another. Within moments, the lobby thundered with applause, echoing off the glass walls and marble floors. It wasn't polite or tentative anymore. It was full, decisive, undeniable. David stood still, his hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He accepted the sound as it was, then turned his attention back to the only person that mattered, his daughter. Lily's small face tilted up toward him, her eyes shining with pride. Karen tried to salvage control. "Enough!" she barked, her voice rising above the clapping. "This is absurd. He's not an executive. He's not a leader. He's a man who cleans floors." She gestured wildly toward the mop bucket still sitting near the fountain. "That's his worth. That's all he is." But her words only fueled the crowd's rejection. A woman in pearls stood, her voice cutting across the lobby. "That man saved a life tonight. What did you do?" Murmurs of agreement spread, turning into open dissent. Karen's face flushed red, the veneer of control crumbling. She tried again, desperate now. "You think this janitor is your savior? Tomorrow he'll be forgotten. This company will still be mine." But the senior investor stepped forward once more, his presence commanding. "You're wrong, Ms. Whitmore. Tonight will not be forgotten, because we all saw the truth, and truth cannot be polished away." He turned to David. "Mr. Hale, you reminded us what real strength looks like." The crowd erupted again, louder, stronger. Applause mixed with cheers, filling the air with vindication. Karen shook her head violently, refusing to accept it. "You're fools. All of you. He's nothing." And then Lily, small and steady, lifted her sketchbook high for everyone to see. Her drawings spilled out as the pages fluttered, images of her father drawn with crayons, always standing tall, always strong, always protecting. She held them up proudly, her voice trembling but clear. "He's my hero. And heroes aren't nothing." The crowd gasped softly, touched in a way no speech could replicate. The innocence of her declaration broke through the last defenses of doubt. A man in a tailored suit whispered, "Out of the mouths of children?" Another replied, "She's right." Karen's fury reached its peak. She lunged forward, her hands snatching for the sketchbook as if tearing it away might erase the moment. But David's hand moved first, firm and protective, intercepting her grasp. His voice, though calm, rang with authority. "That's enough, Miss Whitmore." The firmness of his words silenced the room more completely than her shouting had. Karen froze, her hand still suspended in the air, caught between arrogance and fear. For the first time, it was clear to everyone her power was broken. David lowered Lily's hand gently, tucking the sketchbook back against her chest. "You've tried all night to take my dignity. But dignity isn't something you can steal. It's something you earn or lose by how you treat others. Tonight, you lost yours." The words landed like a gavel. The crowd roared with applause, many rising to their feet. Some chanted his name quietly. Others simply clapped with fierce energy. But the message was unanimous. They stood with David, not Karen. Karen stumbled back, her diamond necklace catching the light like broken glass. She looked around wildly, searching for an ally, but none stepped forward. Even her closest aides avoided her eyes. The empire she had built on intimidation and polish was collapsing in front of her. David took Lily's hand, guiding her toward the exit. He didn't raise his fists, didn't celebrate his victory. He simply walked with the quiet strength that had carried him through every trial. And the crowd parted for him, not as they had for Karen, but with reverence. As he neared the revolving doors, the senior investor called out one final time, "Mr. Hale?" David paused, turning slightly. The man gave a small bow of respect. "You reminded us tonight of something we all forget. that true power lies in protecting, not controlling. Thank you. David inclined his head, acknowledging the words, but offering nothing more. His focus returned to Lily, who smiled through tears. Together, they stepped forward, leaving Karen behind in the ruins of her pride. Victory strategy progress. Public exposure reaches its climax. David delivers a moral verdict in front of witnesses, and Karen's authority shatters. The crowd fully sides with him. Emotional focus, vindication, catharsis, admiration for David, and the collapse of Karen's control. Discovery method. Reputation, leak, and crisis. Trigger, converge. Lily's drawings and David's decisive stand expose the truth in the most public way possible. The cool night air met David and Lily as they stepped out of the building, the marble lobby's noise still echoing faintly behind them. For the first time in hours, David breathed without weight pressing against his chest. He hadn't planned any of it. The confrontation, the reveal, the applause. All he had wanted was to keep his daughter safe and walk home with dignity intact. Yet tonight had proven something more. Sometimes truth refuses to stay hidden, and when it surfaces, it demands to be heard. Lily clutched his hand tightly, her sketchbook pressed to her chest. "Daddy," she whispered, "they all know now. They know who you are." David looked down at her, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "They know enough," he said softly. "What matters is, you've always known." He brushed her hair from her eyes, his voice filled with warmth. "That's all I'll ever need." Behind them, through the tall glass windows, the crowd had not yet dispersed. Karen stood alone, her entourage scattered, her empire trembling beneath the weight of its own arrogance. The senior investor and others spoke in quiet clusters, their eyes no longer deferential to her. In one evening, her reign had shifted from certainty to fragility, undone not by rivals, but by a janitor's steady truth. David didn't glance back. He had no need to savor her downfall. Vindication wasn't about watching her crumble. It was about knowing he had stood tall when it mattered. Lily skipped a small step beside him, her exhaustion mingling with pride. "Do you think Mr. Alvarez will be okay?" she asked. "Yes," David replied, his tone calm and assured. "He'll wake up tomorrow, and when he does, I hope he remembers that life is bigger than titles." They reached the curb, the city lights glowing against the night sky. A bus rumbled past, its windows fogged with tired commuters, a stark contrast to the glittering limousine still parked outside the building. David guided Lily across the street, their steps unhurried, unshaken. For years, he had carried the quiet burden of leaving behind a life others thought defined him. Tonight, that burden had lifted, not because the crowd applauded, not because Karen fell, but because Lily had seen the world recognize the father she already believed in. Her innocence had become the bridge between his past and present, and no cruelty could erase it. Inside the building, Karen finally snapped, her voice carrying faintly even through the glass. "This isn't over," she shouted to the few who remained. But her threat sounded hollow, stripped of authority. Those who once nodded at her every word now turned away. The empire she had flaunted crumbled not with a bang, but with silence. David lifted Lily into his arms, her head resting against his shoulder. Her sketchbook slipped slightly, pages rustling with drawings of him, drawings that had, in their own way, told the truth louder than any defense. He kissed her forehead gently. "Let's go home," he murmured. The night wrapped around them, quiet and forgiving. For David, the marble floors and chandeliers were already fading behind him. Tomorrow he would return to his uniform, to his mop and bucket, to the humble work that gave structure to their lives. But it would be different now, not because the world finally saw him, but because he no longer cared if it did. His dignity was whole. His daughter's pride was unshaken, and his choice, the choice to walk away from prestige to protect what mattered, stood vindicated before witnesses who could never again unsee what they had seen. The city hummed with life, indifferent yet alive, and David found peace in its rhythm. He had faced arrogance, cruelty, and dismissal, and through it all, he had remained steady. That steadiness was his strength, his gift, his legacy to Lily. Tomorrow, people might forget the spectacle. Karen might try to rewrite the narrative, but for those who stood in that lobby, for the investors who saw arrogance collapse before humility, for the servers and staff who had once overlooked him, the image would remain: a janitor who saved a life and revealed a truth money could not bury. David adjusted Lily's weight in his arms, carrying her as the night deepened. The battle was over. The lesson remained. And as he disappeared into the quiet streets, the story of the janitor who humbled a CEO lived on, not in headlines or contracts, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed dignity triumph over arrogance. Victory, strategy, progress. The resolution lands fully. David's truth restores dignity. Karen's authority collapses publicly, and the crowd recognizes real strength. Emotional focus, warm resolution, pride, and calm vindication for David, lasting collapse for Karen. Discovery method, culmination of crisis, trigger and reputation leak. Final validation comes not from power, but from Lily's pride and public recognition. What should the next story be titled? Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?